name is Heidi Stroop, and on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Washington, I welcome you here this evening for our Evening with Thomas Ricks, author of Fiasco, the American Military Adventure in Iraq. I would like to call your attention to several upcoming council events, which details are available at the registration desk just out in the lobby. This Thursday, October 4th, we will host VJ discussing his new book, Zoom, The Global Race to Fuel the Car of the Future. And on October 10, our embassy series continues with a visit to the Mexican Embassy's Cultural Center and a presentation by His Excellency Arturo Saruhan, the Ambassador of the United Mexican States. Thomas E. Ricks grew up in New York and Afghanistan and graduated from Yale. For 17 years, ending in 1999, he was the military correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, reporting on U.S. military activities around the world in the 80s and the 90s. In 2000, he was part of the Wall Street Journal team that won a Pulitzer Prize for national reporting on how the military might change to meet the new demands of the 21st century. In 2000, he moved to the Washington Post and was part of the Post team that won the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for reporting about the beginning of the U.S. counteroffensive against terrorism. In short, he brings experience and understanding through his study of the war. Fiasco is a very good read, a horrific read. One is drawn into the evolving quagmire that is the American military involvement in Iraq, as the author moves quickly through the disastrous lead-up to active hostilities and sets out one mistake after another that compounded the increasing damage to America's position in the initial aftermath of the military actions and developing occupation. Moreover, Ricks goes on to set forth the mistakes of the civilian and top military leadership in failing to anticipate the events that began to unfold almost as soon as that famous statue of Saddam Hussein coming down in the streets. He ends with a series of ever worse case scenarios that preview a world that emerges from the Pandora's box that America's leadership set out to smash in the spring of 2003. This book, by the way, is now required reading at the Army War College. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Thomas Ricks.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Can you all hear me in the cheap seats? I'd like to talk tonight for about 20-25 minutes and then get to your questions, which I think are always the more interesting part of this sort of event. I'd like to begin, though, by asking you one question. Is there anybody here who is a veteran of Iraq or Afghanistan? One hand, two hands, three hands, four hands. Well, thank you very much. That's the end of the nice part of the evening. So I do want to say one other thing. This is sort of a unique evening for me. This is the building in which I wrote this book, on the 6th floor of this book. So it's kind of bringing it home. Now, if you have your antidepressants, you may take them now. Fiasco has a core theme that I'm surprised people didn't pick up on, but I think it only really came out strongly to me when I sat down and reread the book after putting it away for a few months. The core theme of this book is that the American system did not work as designed by the founding fathers. Well, you got plenty more coming, don't you? Yes, President Bush, Vice President Cheney, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld made mistakes. Some of them were whoppers. But people always make mistakes. It's the inability of a system to recover, to adjust, that really makes problems difficult. And that's what happened here. So I think it goes beyond mistakes of a few individuals. You have to look at systemic faults. This is not to excuse the Bush administration. I would put them at the forefront of the mistakes, but I think there are 5 basic systemic mistakes. That's what I want to go through quickly first. First, in the Bush administration, you had 2 major departures. And here, the departures and mistakes, this is striking, again and again, are departures from American tradition. The argument I want to make to you is that this war is anomalous in American history. It really stands out in a variety of different ways. The first is that ever since this country had a Middle East policy, which is about since FDR sat down on the USS Quincy with the King of Saudi Arabia at the end of World War II, ever since we had a policy in the Middle East, our policy was the pursuit of stability. After 9/11, the Bush administration, rightly or wrongly, decided that stability would no longer be our goal in the Middle East. It would be our target. A radical departure from American tradition. The second mistake of the Bush administration was the narrowness of the run-up to the war, the exclusionary fashion in which he went to war. Never a good thing in a democracy, especially bad here because they began with such thin support both domestically and internationally. And they narrowed their support rather than broadened it. What do I mean by that? Well, first, inside the administration, people who raised questions were treated as dissenters, and dissent was treated as disloyalty. Most famously, you have Erich Shinseki, the Army Chief of Staff, saying, as is his duty when asked by Congress, saying, I think you're going to need several 100,000 people for the occupation. And for that, he was put in the deep freeze by the administration. A lesser-known case is somebody I interviewed for the book, a military intelligence officer. Spent a weekend reviewing part of the war plan and wrote a memo saying, there's some real problems here in the war plan. He was thanked for his interest in national defense and not invited back to any more meetings. Politically as well, there was exclusion. Representative Ike Skelton, a conservative Missouri Democrat, very much in the pro-defense, Harry Truman mold. Skelton, before the war, September 2002, sent a letter to President Bush saying, this war raises a series of questions. Have you considered that it would be the first ever American occupation of an Arab country? Have you thought about how long you might have to occupy? The response he got from a White House aide, and I'm quoting here, was, Mr. Congressman, we don't need your vote. Again, a departure from American tradition. Think back to FDR. Who did he have as his Secretary of War? Stimson, a Republican. One result of this war plan, of this approach, was a really lousy war plan. I would argue the worst war plan in American history. Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and General Tommy Franks spent 90% of their time and energy, and of their staffs, on the 10% problem. How do I get to Baghdad? And spent almost none of their time and energy on the 90% problem. What do I do once I get there? For you managers, this is like having an employee who thinks the whole job is the commute. The second major institutional failure was that of the intelligence agencies. Now, you're always going to have politicization of intelligence in our system. Here it happened in a more extreme fashion. The intelligence agencies did not present an honest product to the U.S. Congress or to the executive branch. I don't blame this on the people who actually did the analysis, gathered the data. But as the information wended its way through the Pentagon system of the intelligence bureaucracy, it systematically skewed over in one direction. Information that supported, reinforced Bush administration views was overemphasized. Information that maybe questioned those views or even challenged them was systematically played down, excluded, neglected. I blame that on George Tenet, firmly on his shoulders. It was his job to make sure that didn't happen. Instead, he made sure it did happen. One result of this, by the way, is that the speech that Colin Powell was given to deliver at the United Nations in February 2003. This is a Washington Insider crowd, by the way. Anybody know who wrote that speech for Colin Powell? Any guesses? I'll give you a hint. He's now convicted of a felony. The speech that Scooter Libby initially authored, and it was then reviewed, of course, in the government by everybody else. The speech that Colin Powell presented to the United Nations, we now know to be almost entirely false in all its particulars. Think of that. What an astonishing way to treat a man who's given decades of honorable service to his country. National Security Advisor, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Secretary of State, and they played him like a chump.
Was that deliberate? By accident.
Yeah, they wanted Powell to give the speech, and they didn't care what happened to him, I think. Yes. The third failure was that of journalism, or as my email correspondents call it, mainstream media, the MSN. Journalism flailed about during the run-up to the war. At its best, it tried to get the story, but didn't quite get it, didn't get it in the right place. Stories that should have been written 3 times were written once. There's an old saying in journalism, you write every story 3 times, once when you know it, once when your editor is willing to listen, and once when the public wants to read about it. In this case, sometimes we wrote it just once. I think back to my own coverage. I reread every word the Washington Post and the New York Times published during the run-up to the war. I'm at ease with my coverage, but I wish I'd done things differently. I had breakfast with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs about 10 days before the invasion, and I said to him, "You don't know where these weapons of mass destruction are, do you?" "No," he said, "but I'm confident the Iraqis will show us as we cross the border." Now, I did publish that. Unfortunately, it's paragraph 13 of a 14-paragraph story that ran on page 815. Why? Because people were bored with it. The attitude, both inside the newspaper and generally, was, hey, the war's going to happen, Tom. Stop writing about all the doubts generals are having, all the questions. This thing's going to happen, write about what's going to happen. At its worst, journalism intensified the first 2 failures, most notably in the work of Judith Miller of the New York Times. The fourth failure was that of Congress, in many ways the most interesting of the failures, because unlike the others, this was a sin of omission rather than commission. In other wars, we had hawks and doves. In this war, we had the silence of the lambs. We were 4 years into this war before we had a genuine hearing on the conduct of the war. Again, a real departure from American history and tradition. Think back to the Civil War. We had a committee on the conduct of the war so intrusive it antagonized President Lincoln. World War II, Harry Truman made his name as a senator by holding hearings on defense contracts involving his own party. In Korea, Lyndon Baines Johnson manipulated the hearings of the Senate Armed Services Committee in order to undercut MacArthur, which MacArthur needed, by the way. Most famously, during the Vietnam War, Fulbright held hearings both on the conduct of the war and the policy of the war. There are 2 reasons this is so worrisome. First, the collapse of congressional oversight fails to inform the American people. Second, I would argue, it lessens military effectiveness. Why does it do that? Because when the generals don't ask themselves the tough questions, and in this war the generals didn't, then it's the role of the U.S. Congress to do so. They are supposed to represent the people in asking questions like, hey, General, are you sure this Abu Ghraib is the best way to go in handling Iraqi detainees? Or, hey, General, you say that training and advising is our way out of Iraq. Why do you have reservists doing a lot of that training and advising? Why not get the first team out there? Or, more importantly, the Bush administration has asked you to turn Iraq into a beacon of democracy that will transform the Middle East. That's a huge ambition, bigger than the Marshall Plan. You're going to change not only the politics of a region, but the culture of a region. How could you possibly think you have the resources to do that, General? These were questions that were not asked. It was important that Congress do so. It would have been helpful if Congress do so because of the 5th failure, which is the failure of the military establishment, the failure of American generals. I want to be clear here. I am not criticizing the frontline American troops. Those guys and girls were out there busting their hearts, sweating and bleeding to do the best they could. But tactics without strategy is like a Ferrari without a steering wheel. It'll go fast, it'll be impressive, it'll make a lot of noise, but you're going to wind up in the ditch. And you're not going to go where you want to go. And that's what we had in Iraq. Generals who would not ask themselves the tough questions. Does anybody know here how many generals have been relieved in the Iraq War? Relieved in command? In the Iraq War, it's either 0 or 1, depending how you count Janice Karpinski, the Abu Ghraib commander. It's not clear that whether she was relieved for Abu Ghraib or shoplifting. By the way, it's another contrast and departure from American tradition. During World War II, 17 division commanders were relieved of command, and had 3 or 4 corps commanders. 17 division commanders. That's almost twice as many active duty divisions as we have now. If you didn't win, you got relieved. Why? Because American lives were too precious to waste. Now, as Lieutenant Colonel Paul Yingling recently wrote in a very courageous essay, a private who loses his rifle is punished more than a gentleman who loses a war. I especially blame the generals for putting troops out there untrained, unprepared mentally or physically for the task at hand. If I think back to the 1st Armored Division, I was embedded with the 1st AD in May 2003. A couple of months later, a platoon of the 1st AD was told to deter looters in one part of Baghdad. Now, they'd not been trained for that. They'd not been prepared for it or equipped. They decided on their own that the way to deter looters was to make them cry. Now, you won't find this in any Army manual or any theory of counterinsurgency. Make them cry, they decided. So they catch 2 teenage boys looting along with the boy's father. They say to the boy's father, "Which of your sons do you want us to shoot?" These are American troops. And I'm quoting here from investigatory documents. "No," the father says, as many would, "please shoot me instead." You don't get that choice, the soldiers say. And they take one of the boys around to the other side of a truck. They take out a weapon, and they fire it past the boy's head. Then they let the 3 go, probably crying, probably deterred from looting, but almost certainly not as pro-American as they were when the sun came up that morning. This is an example of tactical success at the expense of strategic goals. I don't blame the troops. What the troops did in that circumstance was wrong, but I blame the people who put them in that situation, which is to say you and me, the American Congress, the Bush administration, but especially the generals who made the ultimate judgment. Let's give these guys a mission for which they are not prepared. They didn't tell anybody. The generals more directly used tactics that were enormously counterproductive and helped inflame the insurgency. Most notably in big cordon and sweep operations that scarfed up tens of thousands of Iraqi males. You know the military is serious when it has an acronym for something? MAMS was the acronym, military-age males. And tens of thousands were stuffed in Abu Ghraib and other detention facilities, frequently held for as long as 90 days without notification of their families, longer, by the way, than the Saddam Hussein regime tended to not to notify families, and without any political discrimination. So hardcore al-Qaeda guys are held cheek by jowl with Average Ahmed the farmer. Essentially, we were the recruiting sergeant for the insurgency. And when Average Ahmed got out 90 days later, perhaps abused or tortured during his stay, with 90 days of indoctrination from some hardcore al-Qaeda type in his cell. Again, probably less pro-American than at the beginning of his adventure. I don't think the military has honestly examined these problems. Some individuals have, but I don't think the military establishment as a whole has. What I'm hearing instead is the bubbling, emerging stab in the back theory. The U.S. military saying, we did everything we were supposed to do, the rest of the U.S. government didn't show up, the Congress betrayed us, the media undercut us, and the American people lacked the stomach, the will, and the patience to see it through. Well, my argument is Iraq is probably worse than Vietnam in many ways. And this is one way. I would say that every aspect of that argument is wrong, demonstrably wrong. And I would turn it back to the military and say, you only started getting the strategy right 4 years into this thing. We had fought longer in Iraq than we fought in World War II before we started having something that really deserved a new strategy. It's as if in 1946, Eisenhower was sitting down there in Morocco saying, any day now I'm going to invade Algeria, but I need to make sure the Congress is behind me. I don't want to be entirely negative. Remember I said at the outset, and I believe this, 99% of the soldiers have done their best every day, 99% of the time they're outside the wire. There also are individual heroes. I think particularly of Colonel H.R. McMaster. I was embedded with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment in February 2006, just after he retook the city of Tal Afar in far northwest Iraq. It was quite striking. McMaster showed something you very rarely see in U.S. military operations, tactical patience. He knew what he wanted to do. It took 6 months to do it because he wanted it to last. He wanted it to be sustainable. McMaster was particularly impressive to me because he took over a unit that had at best a first mediocre tour in Iraq in 2003 and 4. The 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment on its first tour in Iraq had a captain who carried a baseball bat. He called his Iraqi beer, and he used it. There was an Iraqi general who turned himself in for questioning to the 3rd ACR, and for his pains was beaten to death. McMaster assembled his formations when he took command, and he said, every time you disrespect an Iraqi, you are working for the enemy. People think counterinsurgency is a big dollar phrase that you have to go to Harvard to understand. What he did was express counterinsurgency theory in a way that any 20-year-old infantryman can get. Got it, sir. If I beat up on the Iraqis, my buddy could get killed. Got it. McMaster also showed an innovative streak. When he got to Iraq, he started a new program in his unit called Ask the Customer. You know who the customer was? The Iraqi detainees. Every detainee upon release was asked, how were you treated? And by the way, what makes your village anti-American? And what can we do about it, if anything? And the soldiers knew the detainees would be asked. One result was that on the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment's second tour, there was not a single documented case of abuse in the regiment. Finally, McMaster did something I think took both moral courage and audacity. He went to the insurgency and he apologized. Think of that. An American commander on the ground in Iraq apologizing to the evildoers. He sat down with the Sunni clerics and the sheikhs senior connections to the insurgency, and he said, when the Americans first came to Iraq, we were like men stumbling around a dark room. We stepped on toes and broke a lot of furniture. But now an Iraqi government has turned on the lights for us, and the time for honorable resistance has ended. I submit to you that is the most polite death threat you'll ever hear. Translated into American, what he said is, I know who you guys are, I know what you're doing, and I have the means to kill you. But he has expressed it in the core values of Iraqi culture. Honor, dignity, respect. These are words that resonate in the Iraqi ear like democracy and liberty resonate in ours. We instinctually know, yes, that's what we're about, that's what we want. And he spoke to them in those terms. Too often, though, these lessons were ignored. McMaster left, the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment left Iraq. He went off to a think tank in London. He was passed over for promotion to general. Now, he's not out of the Army. He might still make it. And people moved on, and Talafar has slid back down into a mess lately. Okay, to wind up here, where are we now? What happens next? The surge. Every indication is that the current strategy, called the surge, which is really a small dribble of troops over the course of 5 months, is working tactically in many parts of Baghdad, but not all. Security is better in many parts of Baghdad, and the civilian death rate, which is really should be your key metric, appears to be down. Now it's down to about the horror levels of 2005, not the Civil War levels of 2006, but it is down. And we should recognize that. But remember the terms on which the President announced the surge last January 10th. The stated purpose of the surge is not tactical improvement of security. It is a strategic achievement of reconciliation at the national level in Iraq. That's the terms that the President used. And judged on those terms, the surge has failed. No question. This means, first of all, we're going to be in Iraq for several years because I don't think the Democrats are going to pull the plug on this war. They stared it in the face over the last 4 weeks and decided they weren't going to do it. Why? Because while many Democrats were elected on an anti-war basis, they're terrified of having the party tagged with defeat in Iraq as the party was tagged with defeat in Vietnam. They don't want it to be their ending. They want it to be somehow Bush's deal. So on Iraq, I think the beginning of wisdom is to recognize that there are no good answers at this point. We blew past all those answers over the last 4 or 5 years. Where we are now is we need to be asking what is the least bad answer. What do I mean by that? What I mean is you can put any one of 4 or 5 policies in front of me. Pull out, move to containment, partition, escalation, or keep it as it is. And the downside on any one of those policies is greater than the potential benefits on all of them. So it's not you put containment in front of me and I'll tell you why containment's bad. We have to figure out which is least bad, which mitigates the damage we've done, which minimizes the risk of a full-blown civil war or of a regional war. That's why I was saying earlier, the more you look at this, the more you recognize this is a bigger mess than the Vietnam War was. We could walk away from Vietnam. Now, if you were Cambodian and stuff, you had a Holocaust. Or if you were Vietnamese allied Americans, you spent 12 to 15 years off in a re-education camp. But for Americans, it was just 6 years from the fall of Saigon to the election of Ronald Reagan, which was called by some people Morning in America. It is not going to be Morning in America, I think, 5 or 6 years from now in Baghdad. So, what's next? 2 basic courses available to us next year. If things go unexpectedly well, if an Iraqi political breakthrough does occur, if the level of violence stays down, then next spring will bring the beginning of a U.S. troop drawdown. And by sometime in mid-2009, we'll be down to about 50,000 troops. Second course of action. If things go badly, about as they are now or worse, with, say, an Iraqi unit turning on and slaughtering its American advisors, or an entire American outpost destroyed. Then next spring, we'll bring the beginning of a U.S. troop drawdown. And probably by sometime in mid-2009, we'll be about to 50,000 troops. Why the same outcome? Because, as we all know, the current level of troops is unsustainable. They'll tell you at the Pentagon, we're out of Schlitz. So, the real question is not whether there be troops withdrawn. The question is how many troops will be withdrawn, how deep the cuts will go, and more importantly, what will be the mission of the residual force, the force left behind. I think we move away from these broadly ambitious, huge goals the Bush administration laid down of liberating Iraq, turning it into a democracy that then becomes a beacon of change for the Middle East. I think we move away from that to 3 essentially negative goals, which is to say no genocide, no regional war, and no safe haven for al-Qaeda. Think of that, though. Those are still pretty ambitious goals. Just exactly how do you prevent genocide? Even more difficult, how do you prevent a regional war? Especially if you think a regional war might begin in other countries as a result of what's happening in Iraq. Or from refugees flowing in other countries. You've already had at least 1 million, perhaps 2 million Iraqis flee the country. What if another 5 million flee and start destabilizing the region? Do we set up refugee camps inside Iraq along the border? Do we string barbed wire up around a generation of refugees and have American troops guarding them? That feels to me like PLO meets Hezbollah. This leads me to 3 final points, and I really will end here. First, this war rapidly is becoming a problem not for this president, but for the next president. George Bush has basically made most of the decisions he's going to make in Iraq. Second, the next president is not going to be able to get us out of Iraq anytime soon. I think we're going to be in Iraq in 2008, 2009. I'm pretty sure we're going to be in Iraq in 2010, 11, 12, 13. I would not be surprised if we had U.S. troops fighting and dying, and that's the important difference between Korea and Germany and other occupations, fighting and dying in 2015 and maybe 2020. When I was writing Fiasco, I'd look out the window occasionally from my office at these kindergartners who walk every day from the elementary school near my house over to a daycare center. And I would think one of those kindergartners is going to fight and die in Iraq. Finally, I don't think it will end well. I think the best way to think of Iraq is as a tragedy. And keep in mind the Shakespearean tragedies have 5 acts. In Iraq, I think we are at this point only in Act 3. And we have a long way to go. Thank you very much. Okay, I think we have to wait for microphones to arrive for people.
For the courtesy of the audience, please
Please do wait for the mic.
Hi, I'm Richard Youngfleisch. I'm with the Northern Virginia Community College. You mentioned how serious the media was. It didn't do its job as it's doing it. But President Bush has made this connection between the invasion of Iraq and war on terror. And he continues to make it, and the press really lets him get away with it. And they're still doing it. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I would say Iraq is part of the war on terror. I'm just not sure which side it's on. I'm serious about this. If you look at the single largest gainer of political power in post-Saddam Iraq is the radical cleric Muqtada al-Sadr. He is a ferociously anti-American cleric who mounted the largest demonstration ever in support of Hezbollah. So, yeah, they're an enemy of the war on terror. Okay. Iraq clearly was a distraction, in my mind, from the war on terror. I mean, it's just a strategic mistake. General Jack Keane, the Army Vice Chief of Staff, in the tank, where the Joint Chiefs had their discussions, before the war said, don't invade Iraq. Keep 2 Army divisions on the Pakistani-Afghan border until we have Osama bin Laden. And I think that was the wiser course. Even now, I think we could be fighting this very differently. Does everybody here know what the burn rate is in Iraq, by the way? How much do we spend a week?
2.5 billion.
It's actually been up lately. They're about to 3 billion now. Take 1 week of that spending. Give it to the Pakistani government and say, spend it on education. We'd like you to spend it on Western-oriented, maybe English language education, technical stuff. But to spend it on education, really no strings attached. You do it a second year. Here's 1 week of spending in Iraq, $3 billion, spent on education. We'd like to see your teachers respected, nice houses, driving a nice car. Third year. Fourth year, you go and say, here's a $3 billion. This year we have to have bin Laden. I think that would have worked. It would have been money well spent. Right now, Western Pakistan presents a far larger threat to the West than anything in Iraq does. My worry, though, is if we continue to screw up Iraq as long as I think we might, you're going to wind up with the only way you can unify Iraq is under the banner of anti-Americanism. And some new strong man emerges. People say, why don't we just get another Saddam Hussein? The problem is the only Saddam Hussein who could survive, I think, is somebody who's ferociously anti-American. Unites the country under that banner. Gets the oil flowing. Takes the billions of dollars of revenues and buys himself some nuclear weapons. And either passes them to some buddies or sneaks them around. And threatens Tel Aviv, New York, and Washington. Say in the year 2015. You would have precisely the threat the Bush administration falsely believed it faced in 2003, but we would have created it through our actions. So I think the war on terror is out there. We can't wish it away, and we can't undo a lot of the strategic errors we have made. And if you did leave Iraq tomorrow morning, you very well would have probably some al-Qaeda pockets there. Why don't you guys just pick whoever you want to hand mics to, that way we can do it faster.
Thank you, Mr. Ritz. Just alluding to what you said before on Secretary of State Powell, when you meant he was taken for a chump, does that mean that the administration really knew there were no weapons of mass destruction and it was just a propaganda ploy?
No, I think more what I meant was that the Bush administration knew it lacked credibility with the broad mass of the public, especially with the American media and among the international diplomatic community. They knew they could get Powell to say the same things that they could say, and Powell would be believed more than they would. I actually think the Bush administration drank the Kool-Aid. If you don't ever talk to anybody who disagrees with you, you find that, and everybody you talk to who does agree with you, you'll find that you really do believe it. And they did believe it, I think, about weapons of mass destruction. But they had to work really hard to make sure that contrary evidence wasn't presented to them. So I think they really did believe it. I don't think Powell believed it completely. He tried really hard to make sure it was accurate. But it was a losing situation. He's sort of sitting out at CIA headquarters for 3 days with Rich Armitage saying, is this really true? And if you go through the famous National Intelligence Estimate of September 2002 and actually read the footnotes, there were a lot of dissents inside the administration that I think Powell could have gotten to if he really, really wanted to. And talk to the people who filed the dissents. Don't just ask George Tenet, are you sure this is right? It's like asking your kid, are you sure you were the one who smashed up the car? Yeah, I'm sure, Dad. I'm not sure what the microphone is. Just hold it on.
Yeah, hi, Bob Steck. Both from your book and from the book that he had cause to have written, that is, General Petraeus does have the right ideas about how to fight this kind of war. Probably too late. General Odierno, here from your book, is the exact opposite. So I don't understand why he's number 2 to Petraeus these days.
That's a good question. If you haven't read the book, General Odierno commanded the 4th Infantry Division in Iraq in 03-04, and was cited in internal Army documents and in interviews I did with soldiers as having a division that stood out for being particularly aggressive and abusive of the Iraqi population. And also rather lackadaisical about dealing with soldiers who were abusive. One soldier, on a whim, shot a detainee who was handcuffed and behind barbed wire, shot him in the stomach, killed the guy. And the MPs investigated, recommended a charge of homicide. Instead, the guy was just chapped out of the Army for the good of the Army, no charges. Likewise, a battalion of the 4th ID, which was kind of abusive, had a patrol that handcuffed 2 Iraqis and threw them off the bridge into the Tigris River. One of them drowned. The battalion commander knew what had happened, helped cover it up, which is a felony coming up a murder. Was not charged, was not relieved of command. Was issued a letter of reprimand to have a battalion commander, which is a pretty big noise in the U.S. Army, known to have committed a felony under the law of war, and left in command. It just really struck me. Okay, so that was the question I asked myself when I got out to Iraq. What do you know doing out here? And it was really striking to me last time I was there. Essentially, he'd been through a re-education camp. He knew he was going back out to Iraq under General Petraeus, and General Petraeus was beating the drum for counterinsurgency. I think Odierno's attitude was, look, I did what the Army asked me to do in 03-04. You know, you want me to do it different? I'll do it different. Got it. Okay. He's a smart guy. He learns. Also, his son was very badly injured fighting in Iraq. And I think that also had an impact on him. How many kids are we going to put through this grinder until we start realizing maybe there's another way to do this? You know, how is it that we killed the same 2,000, insurgents and Al-Qaeda leaders 10 times? And the insurgency is always the same size, no matter how many detainees we have and how many guys we kill.
We learned how to do that in Vietnam, actually.
Yeah, Tom, today's paper, you have a story about Hillel about the Iraqis doing something themselves. Why can't we just pull out tomorrow? Wouldn't they figure it out? Aren't we being a little elitist by saying we need to stay there to show them the way? They're not stupid.
They're not stupid, but they're not unified. Essentially, what you have is several groups that think they should be running that country. And of such disagreements, wars are made. They're already fighting them in small-scale ways. And it's not just sectarian. Look at down south. Right now, you have 3 Shiite factions fighting for control. There's no Al-Qaeda down there. There's no Sunnis down there. It's a purely Shiite-on-Shiite fight. I do hear this argument, though, occasionally when I'm on the ground in Iraq from young American officers. Look, if these people are determined to have a full-blown civil war, all we're doing is postponing the inevitable. Why don't we get out of the way? I mentioned that to a UN official, and he said, you could do that, but you're also be party to world war crime. You can't just occupy a country and leave when you get tired of it. You have taken on a legal responsibility here. And if there's reason to believe you would have full-blown genocide, you can't just walk away from it. Especially since there's a significant chance of it flowing over the borders to becoming a regional war.
Well, don't you think the Saudi Arabians and Syrians and Iranians work out a settlement? They're not interested in a regional war.
Well, it's a little like Trotsky said. You may not be interested in regional war, but regional war may be interested in you. Nobody can tell you for certainty what would happen, but there are a lot of indications that if you pull back, you will have more violence rather than less. And we just have to ask, Maybe that really is no. Maybe we should just get out of the way and move on a bubble. Or what I think is the Jerry Rubin solution. But as one guy said to me, it probably would be the best recruiting post ever for Al-Qaeda. The Americans went in to the only Arab country that is the natural leader of the Arab world. The only Arab country that has oil, water, and people. And they smashed it into 3 parts, sold it off in parts, and left. Because that's what you would have. It almost never would fly apart. We've also promised our NATO ally, Turkey, we won't let a country fall apart in parts. Before we went in, we told countries in the region. So we'd also break our word to various allies. You also probably would see Iran go in and grab a chunk. Turkey almost certainly would go and start fighting the Kurds. And you probably would see some sort of general Sunni support. You might wind up with 3 regional wars. I mean, 3 mini wars in each region that then would spill over. I mean, these are some pretty bad scenarios. And I think what we need to do is talk seriously about the consequences. With the understanding that that none of the answers are particularly good. What we need to figure out is what to do is bad.
Thank you. My name is June Parsons. I heard recently someone make a comment or a scenario that seemed to make sense to me, which was based on the American model to go back on our own history without touching their culture, which I think is unrealistic. It took us 13 years as a confederation accepting that each one of these colonies ran themselves but agreed to kind of cooperate. Why don't we use Colonel McMaster's? Why isn't somebody saying Colonel McMaster's approach worked? And go into the 3 main regions, realizing the Baghdad area is a little tricky. It may have to be the 4th region. May take a little longer. But if you could settle down the other 3 main areas so that the U.S. really focused on a pretty small area called Baghdad. And maybe we don't like Sadr, but the fact is that Sadr could probably hold a confederation, his component of a confederation together, so that the 8 to 10 years that you're talking about becomes realistic and get us out of the military quagmire and into the economic funding and the education funding that you're talking about. Because I guarantee you the Palestinian example is perfect when you look at what's going on in those refugee camps. When people have no hope, especially young people, they give up and they don't care if they die.
That's a good question because I think it actually describes probably where American policy is going around. Remember Michael Jackson's signature dance, moonwalking? I think we're kind of moonwalking toward a policy. Looking like we're moving forward, but actually moving backwards. I think we're moonwalking towards a soft partition. A soft partition that really does admit, okay, this country has 3 different parts. Large parts of it now have been ethnically cleansed. And what we don't want is to wind up with American troops patrolling the no man's land between those 3 divided parts. If we don't want American troops to be doing that, that means Iraqis will be fighting each other. And it sort of, what we'd be saying is like when you tell your kids, you can go up fist fight outside, just keep it to a low-level war. And don't bother the neighbors. And I think that's kind of what we're going to be walking toward eventually. And Baghdad will sort of try to create a federal city. Even though Baghdad, by the way, really is much more a Shiite city than it used to be. When I was out there in May, one American commander referred to the city neighborhoods as the Sunni zoos. He said they're there only because we keep them alive. And if we leave, the Shiite militias would clean them out. Or he said if American troops aren't present, and this is the hinge of history next spring, if American troops aren't present, he said Shiite-dominated chunks of the Iraqi army will clean them out. And he said, don't fool yourself. He said there's a real overlap between Muqtada Sadr's forces and the Iraqi army, especially the Iraqi police. He said they've gone through units and looked and found every commander in some units, either active members of JAM, Jaish al-Mahdi, the Iraq Sadr's militia, or in financial dealings with JAM, or intimidated. What do I mean by intimidated? I mean they were so good about this. An Iraqi Kurdish battalion was actually moving into Baghdad last spring. And the new battalion commander was riding behind and a vehicle behind the old battalion commander as they kind of explored this area and showed it to him. The new battalion commander is riding along. The vehicle in front of him with the old battalion commander blows up. And the message is, we knew exactly who you're coming in. And then they sent a quiet envoy over and said, look, you guys are only here for 90 days, this Iraqi army is. You want to play it hard, you want to play it soft. We can do it either way. You want to die, or you want to survive the next 90 days. Really adept intimidation based on very precise intelligence and knowing when the new battalion's coming in and knowing which Humvee to blow up. Make sure you get some people in the way back. Well, yeah. The rowdies are saying.
Two brief questions. First, my name is Stephen Shore. What do you make of the size of the American embassy in Baghdad, which is almost humongous, and what could be the consequences of a successful attack, however briefly successful, within the Green Zone, comparable to the Viet Cong attacking the American embassy in Saigon on American morale here?
I don't know, people always talk about how big the embassy is. I mean, I've been in a lot of embassy stuff. It doesn't feel to me that big, especially since you have a lot of army units knocking around there and stuff. It's just, the Green Zone is, sorry?
Aren't they building a whole new one that's supposed to be the biggest in the world?
They are, but remember, you've also got the biggest CIA station in the world there. It's not just a State Department party. You know, the enemy in Iraq would love to do a Tet offensive. I think they've tried it repeatedly and have not succeeded. They've been trying to do a Ramadan offensive this month, and violence has not been up. It's a real notable change. Every Ramadan, the Muslim holy month, we've been in Iraq, we've seen a notable spike in violence until this month. So I think that's why, I mean, really going to say there is some tactical success on the ground in Baghdad. Things are different. Now, you know, it's still hell. We're in a higher circle. So, I mean, you know, they did, I mean, when was it, April of this year, I think, they blew up, a suicide bomber blew up in the parliament, killed 8 people. You know, remember Iraqis essentially have a 9/11 every month in and month out. They've taken a big, big hit. You know, my heart goes out to the average Iraqi family that is too poor to leave the country and is trying to survive this. It really is hell.
I think it would be a good idea if we all reminded ourselves that Iraq was an artificially created entity by the previous occupier of Iraq, Great Britain, and they left. I don't think we should wring our hands over the possibility that there might be a division of Iraq into various cultural or political areas. Secondly, you mentioned that you mentioned the cost, and you've also mentioned the cost in human terms, and you've indicated that we can't sustain that. And then you talk about going on until 2015 or whatever. For what?
For what? Because we're stuck, I think. Because this was the biggest mistake in the history of American foreign policy. Because there are no good alternatives. And I think we'll be paying for this for the rest of our lives. And our children will be paying for it financially for the rest of their lives. The breakup of Iraq doesn't typically bother me. What would bother me is the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians, which is a live possibility, and we have to talk about it. We can't just say nobody can predict the future. No, but there's good indication that it will happen. Now, that may be the best we can do. Maybe all we can do is mitigate that damage. Maybe all we can do is set up good refugee camps. But if that's all we can do, we should start thinking about it. We should start thinking about how do you just don't go around smashing up people's countries and then say, I'm bored, I'm going home. You don't walk out of the movie and think it's going to end just because you left halfway through. And so in some form, we have to see through the consequences of this, no matter what they are.
Andrew Reamer, you began your speech laying out a series of systemic problems. Let's go back to that. Because the inability to deal with them are going to have consequences for moving forward. So if you briefly touch on what needs to be done and what you think is possible, what could stimulate the kind of change where Congress is acting more appropriately, the generals have a better sense of what to do.
Sure, thank you for the question. I wish I talked about in the speech, but I'm glad you asked it. I don't think we need to do a lot, actually, in terms of American laws or structure. In that sense, I think Fiasco is a profoundly conservative book. All it's saying is let the American system, make the American system work in the way the Founding Fathers intended it to do. Most especially, you need 3 co-equal branches of government working in an adversarial fashion, but asserting the prerogatives of each branch, especially in congressional oversight. And I think that is happening. I think what caused the invasion of Iraq by this country was 9/11. Not that Saddam Hussein's Iraq had anything to do with it, but just that it created the opening. It enabled the invasion to occur. Why? Because it knocked the American system off balance. I think this country in some ways panicked after 9/11. And the Congress stopped working and it wouldn't get in the basement. The media was kind of stampeded. The American people were stampeded. When people say to me, why did the mainstream media write that? I say, they did. Why didn't you read it? And so I think we all need to look in the mirror as the American people and say, boy, we kind of screwed that up. We're a little bit like a drunk waking up after a 5-year binge and saying, I can't believe I did it. And your wife is looking and saying, no, you said it. You said it last night. Except this is 5 years. And I think as the system comes into equilibrium again, and I think it is, we're seeing some of these questions being raised. Was this really the best way to go about this? How do we do? But at the same time, we have made huge mistakes that are in many ways unrecoverable. And we simply have to live with them and figure out what to do about them, what the best way to do about them. We can't just ignore them, pretend they didn't happen, and walk away from them.
Andrew Barris. Tom, with the exception of history, is any of this monumental incompetence and arrogance ever going to be accountable?
Well, it's the fun of being a journalist. When you find out. I don't know. I personally think it will be. I think history will remember this as an extraordinary series of errors, beginning with the panicky administration and a lot of incompetence combined with arrogance. And I really do think that's what will come out. You never know. I saw Paul Wolfowitz bicycling yesterday in Rock Creek. And I thought, he must think history's going to prove him right. As he pedaled his way past me. That's why.
Willie Blacklow, to quote you, we need to talk seriously about the consequences. I'm curious as to why, from the aspect of the media, why the electronic media, your current employer, your previous employer, don't discuss the issues that you've discussed. Why don't we see any effort to create a dialogue about where do we go from here, rather than here's where we are?
Let me begin by saying I bear no responsibility for electronic media. It's a totally different, it's like asking a football player about baseball. I don't understand electronic media, they scare me. I do think, though, that the print media is becoming more and more like the electronic media. The defining difference between the two has been the lack of editors and filters in broadcast media. Basically, you put a microphone in front of any monkey and he starts talking. And there's no filter. Geraldo Rivera, live from the battlefield. When I published an article on the front page of the Washington Post, it's been pummeled by 5 pretty smart editors. Is this right? Is this fair? Is this the best approach to this? I mean, I had a story on Monday I thought was really good. It was about how the centrist Democrats in last week's debate all said, well, I can't guarantee you we'll be out of Iraq by 2013, kind of exploring what that meant. I had a wonderful ending, I thought, this discussion of a really smart retired Navy captain, a strategist named Rosemary Mariner, going on about what it means for a democracy to fight a limited war with unlimited endings on it, with an unlimited ending. And the strain was my put on America. And it all got cut from my editor. He said, no, that's another story, Tom. He said, they're talking about domestic effects of the war and stuff. And there's no space for it here. And I had a good argument with him. My editor's Carlos Lozano. And then at the end I said, okay, Carlos, go ahead and, you know. But it was a good discussion. Why are we saying this? How are we saying it? You don't get that in broadcast media. As for why are we having these discussions, I mean, I try to. I mean, this is sort of what I do for the Post. My job is to write what they call the journalistic term is thumbsucking for globe throwers. Can't get Rick's to write a thumbsucking for Sunday. What does it all mean? Where are we all going? That's what I do. Kind of try to look forward and stuff. That said, it's a fairly expensive proposition for newspapers to do. And the only newspapers that seem to be able to afford this anymore send somebody like me to Iraq 6 times a year to have adequate security when I'm knocking around Iraq and so on. It's the New York Times and the Washington Post. Our security in our Baghdad bureau costs $1 million a year. Now that's not a lot for a big company. You know, but the Washington Post is basically a cottage industry.
What company? what company do you guys use?
I'm not going to discuss it. But I'll tell you, it's not Blackboard. In fact, there is no such company. I mean, they're all Washington Post employees. And our bureau chief who set up our security structure, Rajiv Chandrakasaran, who's going to be speaking to you guys I think in a couple of months. Rajiv did a beautiful job in security. Very different from the Blackwaterish approach. Very low key. I remember I was walking out of, we live in the red zone, by the way, which is what the U.S. military calls the rest of Iraq. Our house is in the red zone. And I was walking out of the house one day last May, and it was a chilly morning for some reason, and I was wearing a long sleeve black t-shirt. And our security chief, a guy named Mohammed, looked at me and said, back in the house, change your shirt. And I said, why? And he said, because you look like a Blackwater guy. Worst things to look like on the streets of Baghdad are Blackwater or CIA. And Iraqis noticed it. And so I went back in the house and I dressed like a journalist.
Rick Marshall. I wondered if you could discuss what you think Iran's current role is, but more importantly, where do you think Iran is actually kind of heading, say, over the next year under current conditions?
I think it's pretty clear that Iran is very active inside Iraq, probably more active than we realize. When I talk about the U.S. military not seriously studying the lessons of this war, failures of the U.S. military establishment, one of the things that should be examined in my ideal world is look at the Iranian operation inside Iraq as the ideal training and advisory program. Far less expensive, far more effective than ours, I would say. They never went by numbers. Remember in the old days, a couple of years ago, as they stand up, we will stand down? Well, they stood up, all the numbers were realized, and you still don't have an effective Iraqi security force. The Iranian training and advisory program was never based on numbers. It was based on effectiveness, military effectiveness, the ability to whack your enemy. And so right now, for example, the Iraqi government won't hold provincial elections in the south because they know that Mahdi army is going to win. And they're refusing to hold the provincial elections. So the Mahdi army is holding its own primaries. It's killing the governors. It's very effective. The Iranians also, with the explosively formed projectile, these quite ferocious roadside bombs that are really, really murderous. Whenever you see in the newspaper that there's been a Humvee blown up and 4 guys are killed, that's almost always with these EFP bombs rather than typical roadside bombs. And the evidence seems to be pretty strong that those that come out of Iran. That was a Hezbollah bomb with Iranian origins. That said, I don't think there's going to be a war with Iran.
You do?
I don't. I just don't think that the politics will back that at this point. On the other hand, a guy in the Bush administration said to me one day, I said, are we going to do anything with Iran? And he said, well, tell me if the president goes below 20%. And I said, what do you mean? He said, if he goes below 20%, what does he get to lose? So, but I don't think so, because we created, if you wanted to deal with Iran, the last thing we wanted to do was have U.S. troops in Iraq. Because essentially we have 160,000 hostages in Iraq right now. We lean on them about the nuclear program. They lean on us and dial up the violence against American troops. And I think they've shown an ability to do that, to respond to pressure in that way. So I think we're kind of a little bit of a standoff with Iran, but given the circumstances, they win a standoff. The tie goes to Tehran in this instance. The only hope we have with Iran is, as Toby Dodge, a very good British analyst, put it, the only place you see more hubris than Washington, D.C. is Tehran. And there's the hope the Iranians will overplay their hands, what they well might in Iraq. There was a good Pentagon war game on this, which concluded that if we implement the Iraq study group recommendations, you'd wind up with a Shiite-on-Shiite civil war in the South, in which Iran would intervene on one side and wind up quagmire in the South. And this is sort of Pentagon's exit strategy. Here, you guys get quagmire. But I think Iran is the long-term beneficiary of American operations in Iraq. And what we have done is effectively knock down the Arab barrier to Persian expansion westward. And what you're going to wind up with is Persian power extending to the West Bank and Euphrates, about 150 miles moving west of where it's been historically. Is that a terrible thing? No. But it does mean that a big chunk of the world's oil will be, Iran will have influence, at least, over its disposition. And that the natural leader of the Arab world, Iraq, isn't somehow a subsidiary of Iran. And I don't think that's good for this country or for the West either. Then we have to sit back and wait, as our policy has been, to wait for the Iranian regime to change. But suddenly we've strengthened that existing regime through our action. And there's a number of ways it really strikes me. If you looked at Osama bin Laden's agenda on September 10th, 2001, it basically, he had three basic, every day, eyewitnesses predicted, and so I think any military expert. Recruiting would be way down, people would not be re-enlisting, they have real personnel problems in the military. Now they have strengths in the military, but I've been surprised how cohesive the military has been. This is sort of the one upside I can see. It's held together surprisingly well. And I think it's because it's a small professional force. You know, in Vietnam, when the guy next to you got shot, you might not even know him. He might be a new guy. In this war, you know, when somebody in your squad gets shot, you likely lived next door to him back at Fort Campbell, watched him bring home his babies from the hospital, know his wife, maybe met him, you know, was there when he met his wife. You've been around these guys for years. So it's a very cohesive military. It also means when you do suffer casualties, it's quite emotionally powerful. These are not just comrades, but frequently best friends of several years' duration. If you can get the troop numbers down, the targets they have, 100,000 by the end of 2008 and 50,000 by mid-2009, you should significantly reduce the strain on the U.S. military. Right now, people are doing 15 months over there, and if they're lucky, 12 months at home. If they're not lucky, 7 months. And that's not just 7 months of sitting at home drinking beer and watching a game. You know, you come home, you go on leave, and then you start reconstituting the unit, bringing in some new recruits, you know, some newly trained guys, and then going off for a training cycle that has you running around the woods or the desert for a big chunk of time, and then deploying, and a very busy schedule. But if you get it down to 50,000, you will significantly lose the strain on the U.S. military. I think you could probably maintain 50,000 troops in Iraq for many years. We really have to, without the U.S. military breaking a sweat. Especially if you're in Balad. Balad is a great place. I love Balad. It's like, for me, it's like R&R in Iraq. Balad's run by the Air Force, by the way.
Marcia Lewis. As a follow-up to the question about
politics in Iraq. If you were to look at the politicians who are possible successors to Maliki, do you see any that you think would be able to achieve the kind of national reconciliation and general goals that we have? And as a follow-on, Mokhtar al-Sadr's father is no longer with us. If something happened to Mokhtar al-Sadr, who do you think would replace him?
Second question's easy. I have no idea. On the first, I'll tell you what my fear is. We're told one day that an Iraqi general in Baghdad has taken control of the government. And the American military and the American government standing back and saying, okay, it's their government. And I actually think the Baghdad security is one of the dangers of the Baghdad security plan, is that it puts an Iraqi general in charge of all of Baghdad. And it allows, the Iraqi military is much more in touch with the Iraqi people than any Iraqi politician is at this point. The Iraqi politicians are all behind the blast walls of the green zone. The Iraqi military is out and about, much more in touch with the people. That is one of the classic conditions of coup d'etat. And so I think we're drifting, in many ways, toward the likelihood of a military coup d'etat, which is not a good outcome. It's not what anybody planned for. But I think a lot of Americans would say, finally, at least some guy's going to run the country. But that strikes me as not really a worthy goal for us to pursue. We down to the last question here? Let's make this the last question. I see the rolling wine and beer back there.
So I got the last question.
Yes.
Veronica Parker-Robinson. My question, following on the young man's, about the military. This is in terms of the reserves. You're talking about 50,000 American troops. Are you including the backup of the reserves that also are there now? We decimated almost all of the reserves that we would have here at home to help fight all kinds of needs here.
No, I don't think you see a lot of use of the Guard reserves, but for exactly the reason you lay out. They've been worked real hard, harder than anybody expected, I think, when they enlisted in the reserves. This is one reason to get the troop size down, is it becomes, at least for the first couple of years, almost entirely an active duty mission. Basically, it would be 5 brigade combat teams, all active duty with support forces. And you'd have some reserve support forces, but you probably go to an all-voluntary basis on it. There's a lot of reservists who like it. They make more money in the reserves than they do in their regular jobs. I remember asking the advisor one day at a green zone, why are you doing this advising mission? He said, well, I don't employ. And I thought, not sure that's quite, the way to get the best and the brightest out of it. Have full employment for Iowa reservists. No, but I think the reserves, there's a real recognition that in a very strained military, the reserves are feeling the strain the hardest right now. I mean, I'm seeing units that are just totally cobbled together because they've again, given to other units to get them deployable. So now when reserve units trying to deploy, it's a mess. There's like nobody left. So you're starting with maybe 15, 20% of the original unit and then putting in 85% strangers, which is the opposite of what you want to have a good piece of the military. It's the opposite of what you have in the active duty military. I am here also. I'm willing to sign books. I think you can buy them outside, but if you want to sign books, just come up here and I'll sign them. Thank you very much.